Sometimes the loudest applause hides the quietest truth. My name is Ethan Walker, and until that evening, I believed I understood exactly what success looked like. My wife, Olivia, had just been named top salesperson at Bennett Financial Group, the company founded and led by her father, Richard Bennett. For months, I had watched her leave before sunrise, return long after dark, answer client calls during weekends, and study sales reports while most people were relaxing with their families. She earned every bit of that recognition through discipline and determination. I was proud of her in ways I could barely describe. When Richard invited our entire family to celebrate at one of the finest restaurants in downtown Chicago, I never imagined the evening would become one of the most unforgettable nights of my life. The private dining room overlooked the city skyline, with floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting thousands of lights across the river below. A long table was decorated with white roses, polished silverware, crystal glasses, and framed photographs showing Olivia's journey from her first day at the company to the moment she accepted the award only hours earlier. Her co-workers, several executives, and a few close family friends had also been invited. Everyone wanted to congratulate the woman who had broken the company's annual sales record. Richard stood near the head of the table, holding a glass of sparkling cider. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent decades leading meetings. "Tonight," he announced proudly, "we are not celebrating numbers. We are celebrating dedication, integrity, and someone who proved that hard work still matters." The room immediately filled with applause. Olivia smiled modestly, thanking everyone with a graceful nod. She had never been comfortable being the center of attention, even though she had certainly earned it. As I watched her standing there beneath the warm chandelier lights, I remembered every evening she had doubted herself. I remembered encouraging her after difficult client meetings, helping her rehearse presentations in our living room, and reminding her that persistence usually outlasted disappointment. None of those moments needed public recognition. Watching her receive this award was enough. Dinner was served shortly afterward. Conversations flowed naturally as everyone shared stories about Olivia's professionalism and work ethic. Richard spoke about how she had exceeded expectations despite the pressure of being the owner's daughter. Several managers praised her ability to build genuine relationships with clients instead of chasing quick results. Every compliment sounded sincere. Every smile appeared genuine. I relaxed, believing the evening would simply become another cherished family memory. Then, halfway through the main course, Olivia quietly placed her fork on the plate. She slowly stood from her chair and gently tapped her glass with a spoon. The conversations faded almost instantly. Everyone turned toward her with warm smiles, expecting another heartfelt thank you speech. Richard leaned back proudly in his chair, clearly anticipating a touching moment. Olivia looked around the room before her eyes finally met mine. Something in her expression immediately caught my attention. She was smiling, but her smile seemed heavier than before, as though she had been carrying something much larger than a trophy all evening. She took a slow breath before speaking. "There is something I have wanted to say for a very long time," she began softly. "Winning this award means more to me than anyone here probably realizes." The room remained perfectly silent. She glanced briefly toward her father before looking back at the guests. "Everyone has been congratulating me today," she continued. "Everyone has been telling me how proud they are of what I accomplished." She paused for several seconds. I could feel the atmosphere shifting, though I could not explain why. Even the servers standing quietly along the walls seemed to sense that something unexpected was about to happen. Olivia folded her hands together and drew another careful breath. "But before this celebration continues," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "there is one truth I can no longer keep to myself." At that exact moment, every smile around the table slowly disappeared, and I realized this dinner was no longer just about celebrating an award. Olivia's words settled over the room like complete silence. Nobody reached for a glass. Nobody continued eating. Even the soft music playing through the restaurant speakers seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. Richard looked at his daughter with quiet curiosity rather than concern. He still believed she was preparing to deliver another gracious acceptance speech. I remained seated, watching her carefully. After years of marriage, I had learned to recognize the difference between the smile she offered the world and the expression she wore when something truly mattered. This was the second one. She looked around the table once more before speaking again. Today, everyone congratulated me for becoming top salesperson, she said. I appreciate every kind word, but I cannot accept all of the credit by myself. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Melissa Carter, the company's sales director, slowly folded her hands together and focused entirely on Olivia. Richard leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? He asked gently. Olivia smiled at her father with warmth and respect. I mean exactly what I said. I worked incredibly hard, and I am proud of what I accomplished. But there are people whose support made this possible, and I have never acknowledged them the way I should have. I felt my shoulders relax just a little, although I still had no idea where the conversation was heading. Olivia reached for the award resting beside her chair. The crystal trophy reflected the lights hanging above the table as she held it in both hands. Every client meeting, she continued, every presentation, every business trip, every late night at the office came with sacrifices that many people never saw. She paused before looking directly at me. Someone else was making sacrifices too. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward me so quickly that I almost looked behind myself to see whether someone else had entered. I remained completely still. Olivia continued speaking before anyone could react. While I was chasing sales goals, my husband quietly adjusted his own schedule. He cooked dinners when I worked late. He listened to every presentation before I gave it to a client. He practiced difficult questions with me until I stopped being nervous. He celebrated every small victory and reminded me to keep going after every disappointing week. I immediately shook my head slightly, hoping she would not continue. Recognition had never been why I supported her. She noticed my reaction and smiled kindly. You are doing exactly what you always do, she said softly, trying to stay in the background. A few people around the table smiled, but nobody interrupted. Richard looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not surprise alone. It was reflection. Melissa quietly nodded to herself as though several pieces of a puzzle had suddenly fallen into place. Olivia gently placed the trophy back on the table. I accepted this award today because my name earned the sales numbers, she said. But those numbers were built on encouragement that happened after business hours, in our living room, at our kitchen table, and during countless evenings when nobody else was watching. I lowered my eyes for a moment, unsure how to respond to so much attention. Richard finally spoke. Ethan, he said sincerely, is that true? I smiled modestly before answering. I simply did what any husband who believes in his wife would gladly do. Richard looked from me back to Olivia. The room remained completely silent. Nobody applauded this time because the atmosphere had changed into something much deeper than celebration. Melissa slowly stood from her chair. If I may, she said respectfully, I think there is something everyone here should know before this evening continues. Her calm voice immediately drew the attention of every person in the room, and the expression on Richard's face told me he realized the night was about to reveal far more than anyone had expected. Melissa remained standing for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the back of her chair. She looked first at Richard, then at Olivia, and finally at me before speaking. I have managed the sales department for nearly 12 years, she said calmly. During that time, I have seen talented people succeed, and I have also seen talented people struggle under expectations they never asked for. Olivia has faced both. Richard listened carefully without interrupting. Melissa continued. When Olivia joined the company, many employees quietly assumed she would receive special treatment because she was the owner's daughter. Some believed her promotions would come easily. Others questioned whether she belonged in the sales division at all. Several managers lowered their eyes, clearly recognizing the uncomfortable truth in her words. Olivia stood quietly beside her chair, saying nothing. Melissa smiled gently toward her. Instead of asking for advantages, Olivia requested the exact opposite. She asked me to assign her the most difficult territories and the accounts that experienced representatives had already failed to develop. She wanted every result to speak for itself. I remembered those early years perfectly. There were evenings when Olivia returned home exhausted after driving hundreds of miles across Illinois, only to spend another 3 hours preparing proposals for clients who might never sign a contract. She never complained about the workload. She only worried that one unsuccessful quarter would convince people she had earned her position because of her last name rather than her effort. Melissa continued. There were weeks when I suggested she take a break. She always answered with the same sentence. She said she wanted every number on the sales report to remove another doubt from someone's mind. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, visibly absorbing every word. I could tell he was hearing parts of his daughter's journey for the first time. Running a company had demanded much of his attention, and although he loved Olivia deeply, he had not witnessed many of the quiet struggles that happened beyond executive meetings. Melissa turned toward me with a warm expression. There is something else I should share. More than once, Olivia arrived at the office after spending half the night preparing presentations. Every time I asked how she managed to stay motivated, she smiled and told me her husband refused to let her quit believing in herself. I felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. I only reminded her of what she was already capable of, I replied. Melissa nodded. Perhaps, but encouragement given consistently over several years is more valuable than most people realize. Richard looked directly at me. Why did you never tell me any of this? I smiled respectfully. Because it was never about receiving recognition. Olivia earned every contract herself. I simply believed in the person doing the work. Olivia quietly wiped away a small tear before speaking again. That is exactly why I needed to say something tonight. Every award has one name engraved on it, but success is rarely built by one person alone. The room remained silent for several long moments. Then Richard slowly stood from his chair and walked around the table. Instead of addressing the guests, he stopped directly in front of his daughter. I thought I understood how hard you worked, he said softly. Tonight, I realized I only saw the results, not the sacrifices behind them. Olivia hugged her father gently, and the room filled with a warmth that had been missing since the celebration began. When they stepped apart, Richard turned toward me with an expression of sincere gratitude. Ethan, he said, there is something I need to ask you after dinner. His tone was calm, but I sensed the conversation would extend far beyond congratulations. At that moment, I realized the evening was no longer about a sales award. It had become an opportunity for an entire family to finally understand the unseen efforts that had carried one remarkable achievement from an impossible dream into reality. After dinner concluded, most of the guests slowly drifted toward the restaurant's lounge area, where coffee and dessert were being served. The atmosphere had softened, yet the conversations were noticeably quieter than before. Richard approached me with a thoughtful expression and gestured toward the private balcony overlooking the Chicago River. Would you mind joining me for a few minutes? He asked. I nodded, and we stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sounds of the city floated up from the streets below, while the lights reflected across the water in gentle waves. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Richard rested his hands lightly on the balcony railing before finally breaking the silence. I have spent my entire career believing I could recognize hard work, he said. Tonight, I realized I overlooked something just as important. I waited patiently, knowing he was choosing his words carefully. When I watched Olivia accept that award this afternoon, he continued, I saw an exceptional employee. During dinner, I began seeing the people who quietly helped her become that employee. I smiled politely. She accomplished more than anyone gives her credit for. Richard nodded. I agree. But I also understand now that success inside a family is rarely an individual achievement. He turned toward me with genuine sincerity. Melissa has mentioned your name several times over the past few years. That surprised me. She has. Only in passing, Richard replied. She once told me Olivia always seemed unusually prepared before major client presentations. I assumed that was simply her personality. Tonight, I learned there was another reason. I laughed softly. Most evenings we turned our dining room into a practice conference room. I pretended to be difficult clients and asked every challenging question I could imagine. Richard smiled for the first time since leaving the table. That explains something I never understood. I looked at him curiously. What is that? Every time Olivia entered an important presentation, she appeared remarkably calm. I always thought confidence came naturally to her. I shook my head gently. Confidence usually came after 20 practice sessions. Richard laughed quietly. Then his expression became thoughtful once again. There is something I regret, he admitted. As her father and as the owner of the company, I focused so much on making sure nobody accused me of favoritism that I rarely asked how she was truly handling the pressure. His honesty reminded me of many conversations Olivia and I had shared over the years. She never wanted special treatment. but she sometimes wished her father would see the emotional weight that accompanied every accomplishment. She never wanted anything handed to her, I said. If anything, she worked harder because she believed every success had to silence another doubt. Richard slowly nodded. I see that now. We remained on the balcony for another minute before he asked a question I had not expected. Did she ever consider leaving the company? I hesitated briefly before answering honestly. Yes, more than once during her first 2 years. Richard looked genuinely surprised. She never told me. She was afraid you would think she lacked commitment, I explained. She stayed because she loved the work, respected your company, and wanted to prove she belonged there on her own merit. Richard exhaled slowly as he looked across the river. I wish she had trusted me enough to tell me. Perhaps, I replied gently. She first needed to believe that being vulnerable would not disappoint you. Those words remained between us for several quiet seconds. Finally, Richard straightened his jacket and offered me a warm smile. Thank you, Ethan. Not only for supporting my daughter, but for telling me the truth tonight with kindness instead of resentment. I shook my head. There was never any resentment. I simply wanted Olivia to receive every opportunity she earned without carrying unnecessary pressure. Richard extended his hand, and I gladly accepted it. I think tomorrow morning, he said. I need to begin listening more carefully than I have been speaking. As we returned inside the restaurant, I noticed Olivia and Melissa talking quietly near the windows. Olivia looked relieved, almost lighter than she had earlier that evening. Something had changed, not because of the award itself, but because the people she cared about were finally beginning to understand the unseen journey that had brought her there. I had a feeling the conversation started that night would continue long after the celebration ended, and for the first time, I believed they would lead our family towards something even more valuable than professional success. The next morning, Olivia and I sat together on our back porch with 2 cups of coffee as the sun slowly rose above the neighborhood. Neither of us mentioned the award at first. Instead, we simply enjoyed the quiet, something that had become increasingly rare during the months leading up to the company's annual sales competition. Eventually, Olivia smiled softly and broke the silence. I slept better last night than I have in weeks, she admitted. I looked at her with curiosity. Because the competition is finally over? She shook her head. Because I finally stopped carrying everything by myself. Her answer stayed with me. For years, I had watched her take responsibility for every challenge that came her way. She believed asking for help might make people question whether she deserved her accomplishments. Last night had been the first time she openly acknowledged that no meaningful success is ever built entirely alone. A few hours later, Richard called and invited us to stop by the company headquarters before lunch. His voice sounded calm but thoughtful, and I sensed he had spent much of the night reflecting on everything that had been said during dinner. When we arrived, Melissa welcomed us into the executive conference room where Richard was already waiting. The large windows overlooked downtown Chicago, and sunlight filled the room with a brightness that felt completely different from the emotional atmosphere of the previous evening. Richard stood as we entered. Instead of beginning with business, he looked directly at Olivia. I owe you an apology, he said sincerely. Olivia looked surprised. Dad, you do not have to apologize. He gently shook his head. I do. I spent years making certain nobody could accuse me of giving you special treatment. In doing that, I unintentionally stopped asking whether you needed support as my daughter. Olivia's eyes immediately softened. I always knew you believed in me. Richard smiled sadly. Believing in someone is important. Letting them know they never have to carry every burden alone is just as important. The room became quiet again. Melissa broke the silence with a thoughtful observation. Yesterday reminded me that every sales report tells only part of the story. Numbers measure results, but they never measure encouragement, patience, or the people standing behind those results. Richard nodded. Exactly. He then turned toward me. Ethan, I have another apology to make. I raised my hand gently. There is no need. There is, he continued. I thanked Olivia many times for helping this company grow. I never thanked the person who quietly helped her stay strong enough to do it. I smiled modestly. I never expected recognition. Watching her succeed has always been enough for me. Richard walked across the room and placed a small framed certificate on the conference table. At first, I assumed it belonged to Olivia. Instead, it contained a simple inscription. It read, "In appreciation of the families who make excellence possible." I looked at Richard with surprise. What is this? He smiled warmly. Beginning this year, every major company award will recognize not only outstanding employees, but also the support systems that make long-term excellence possible. We cannot celebrate achievement while pretending people accomplish everything alone. Melissa nodded enthusiastically. Several managers have already said they love the idea. Olivia quietly reached for my hand beneath the table. I could feel how much this moment meant to her. It was never about giving me public credit. It was about changing the way success itself was understood. Richard looked around the room before speaking once more. The strongest companies are built by strong people. Strong people are often supported by strong families. We should never forget that. As we left the building later that afternoon, Olivia leaned her head gently against my shoulder while we walked toward the parking garage. Yesterday, I thought I was giving a speech about gratitude, she whispered. Today, I realized we started something much bigger. I smiled as we stepped into the warm afternoon sunlight. Sometimes the greatest achievement is not winning an award. Sometimes it is helping everyone see the people who were quietly standing behind it all along. That weekend, Olivia suggested we take a long walk along the Lake Michigan shoreline before the next busy workweek began. The spring air was cool, and families filled the walking paths while children laughed in nearby parks. It felt good to step away from conference rooms, sales reports, and emotional conversations, even if only for a few hours. As we watched the waves roll gently onto the shore, Olivia slipped her hand into mine and smiled with a sense of peace I had not seen in months. I finally understand something, she said quietly. For years I believed success meant proving that I could do everything on my own. Now I realize real success is knowing when to appreciate the people who walk beside you. I smiled. You never had to prove your worth to me. She nodded. I know. The difficult part was believing I did not have to prove it to everyone else. We continued walking in comfortable silence until we found an empty bench overlooking the water. Olivia sat down and looked toward the horizon. Do you remember my first month at the company? She asked. I laughed softly. You called me every evening convinced someone would discover you were not good enough. She covered her face with one hand and laughed. I cannot believe I actually said that. You did, I replied. And every time I reminded you that confidence grows through experience, not through perfection. She leaned gently against my shoulder. I needed those reminders more than you probably realized. A few moments later, my phone vibrated. The message was from Richard. He asked whether we would join him for lunch at a small neighborhood restaurant the following day because he wanted to continue the conversation away from the office. We accepted immediately. The next afternoon, we met him at a quiet family-owned restaurant where no one recognized him as the company's founder. Without boardrooms or executives nearby, he seemed more like a father than a business leader. After the meals arrived, Richard folded his hands together and spoke with remarkable honesty. I spent most of my career believing that providing opportunities was the greatest gift I could give my family, he said. I recently realized that listening is just as important. Olivia smiled warmly. You have been listening much more these past few days. Richard nodded. Because I finally understood something your speech helped me see. Leadership at work and leadership at home are not the same thing. Employees need direction. Family members also need reassurance. I watched the conversation unfold with quiet appreciation. Neither of them was trying to defend old decisions anymore. They were simply trying to understand each other better than before. Richard looked toward me. Ethan, I have one favor to ask. Of course. If you ever see me becoming too focused on business again, remind me that my family deserves the same attention I give the company. I smiled. I can do that, but only if you promise to remind me whenever I forget to take care of myself while supporting everyone else. Richard laughed warmly. That sounds like a fair agreement. Olivia looked between us with grateful eyes. This is exactly what I hoped would happen after dinner. Not praise, not recognition, just honest conversations. After lunch, the three of us walked through a nearby neighborhood park where blooming trees lined the pathways. We spoke about future vacations, family traditions, and simple moments we wanted to protect regardless of how busy work became. For the first time since Olivia joined the company, every conversation about business naturally returned to family instead of replacing it. As the afternoon came to an end, Richard stopped before getting into his car. The award will eventually gather dust on a shelf, he said thoughtfully. The conversations we started because of it will stay with me much longer. Olivia hugged her father before turning toward me with a peaceful smile. As we drove home beneath the clear blue sky, I realized the greatest change had not happened inside the company at all. It had happened within our family. We had learned that appreciation should never wait until a celebration. Understanding should never arrive only after misunderstandings. And the strongest relationships are built through countless ordinary conversations that quietly strengthen extraordinary lives. Several weeks passed, and life gradually settled into a healthier rhythm. Olivia still worked long hours when necessary, but something important had changed inside the company. Richard had introduced a new leadership initiative that encouraged managers to recognize not only measurable performance, but also collaboration, mentorship, and the support systems that helped employees succeed over time. At first, many people assumed it was simply another corporate program that would quietly disappear after a few months. Instead, it slowly transformed the culture in ways no one expected. During one Monday morning meeting, Melissa invited every department manager to share stories about employees whose behind-the-scenes efforts had made major accomplishments possible. The room, usually filled with charts and sales projections, became filled with genuine appreciation. One manager spoke about a veteran employee who mentored every new salesperson without ever asking for recognition. Another described an administrative assistant whose careful planning had prevented countless scheduling problems during a difficult quarter. For the first time, success was no longer described only by numbers printed on monthly reports. It was measured by the positive impact people quietly made every day. Olivia told me about the meeting that evening while we prepared dinner together. She chopped vegetables while I stirred a pot of homemade soup, and she smiled more than she had in months. "You know what surprised me the most?" she asked. I looked over curiously. "What?" Several people admitted they had been carrying invisible pressure for years because they thought asking for encouragement would make them appear weak. I nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes people confuse independence with isolation. She smiled. "That is exactly what Melissa said." After dinner, Olivia opened her laptop and showed me an email Richard had sent to every employee. It thanked the entire company for embracing a workplace built on trust, respect, and shared success. Near the end of the message, one sentence immediately caught my attention. "Great achievements are rarely created by one person alone, and great organizations should never forget the people standing quietly beside every success." Olivia looked at me. When I read that sentence, I thought about the night of the celebration. I laughed softly. "So did I." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That evening embarrassed me at first because I thought I had interrupted a perfect celebration. Now I realize it gave us the opportunity to build something much better than a perfect speech. A few days later, Richard invited us to attend the company's quarterly leadership luncheon. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different from the previous celebration. There were no formal awards waiting on the stage and no dramatic announcements planned for the evening. Instead, employees shared brief stories about coworkers who had encouraged them through difficult moments. Some spoke about experienced mentors. Others thanked supportive teammates or understanding family members. The room was filled with quiet smiles rather than loud applause. Near the end of the event, Richard stepped onto the stage. "Leadership begins with listening," he said. "Achievement grows through teamwork. Lasting success becomes meaningful only when gratitude is shared instead of assumed." He then surprised everyone by inviting Olivia to stand beside him. She looked slightly nervous, but accepted with her usual grace. Richard smiled proudly at his daughter before addressing the audience once more. "This year, our highest sales award recognized outstanding performance," he said. "Today, I would like to recognize something equally important: the courage to remind all of us that appreciation should never remain unspoken." The room responded with warm applause, but this time the applause felt different. It celebrated humility rather than achievement alone. Olivia looked toward me for just a moment and smiled with quiet gratitude before returning her attention to the audience. In that simple glance, I realized neither of us needed another speech to understand what had changed. Recognition had become less important than honesty. Awards had become less important than relationships. And every conversation that followed that unforgettable dinner continued proving that genuine success is measured not only by what people accomplish, but also by the kindness, encouragement, and gratitude they choose to share along the way. Autumn arrived almost unnoticed, bringing crisp mornings and streets lined with golden leaves. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt very different from the constant pressure we had experienced only a few months earlier. Olivia still loved her work, but she no longer measured every day by sales numbers alone. Instead, she often came home talking about the younger representatives she had been mentoring. One evening, while we prepared dinner together, she smiled and said, "I finally understand that helping someone else succeed feels just as rewarding as reaching another personal milestone." I looked at her with quiet admiration. "You always had that ability," I replied. "You simply did not have enough time to notice it." She laughed softly. "Maybe I was too focused on proving myself." A few weeks later, Richard invited us to attend the company's annual leadership retreat held at a conference center just outside Chicago. Unlike previous years, the event was not centered entirely on financial performance. Workshops focused on communication, teamwork, mentorship, and creating a healthier workplace culture. During one afternoon session, employees were invited to share moments that had changed the way they viewed success. Several people spoke about difficult projects or professional accomplishments, but one story after another gradually returned to the same idea. The greatest breakthroughs had happened because someone believed in them before they believed in themselves. Listening from the audience, I realized how far the company had come. Melissa stepped onto the stage and introduced a new tradition called the Legacy Circle. Instead of recognizing only the highest performing employees, every department would now nominate individuals who quietly strengthen the people around them. Managers, assistants, mentors, administrative staff, and even family members could be acknowledged for the encouragement they provided behind the scenes. The audience responded with genuine enthusiasm. There was no competition in the room that afternoon, only appreciation. During a short break, several employees approached Olivia to thank her for speaking honestly during the celebration dinner months earlier. One young sales representative admitted that she had almost resigned because she constantly compared herself with more experienced coworkers. "After hearing your story," she told Olivia, "I stopped believing I had to carry every challenge by myself. I finally asked my team for guidance, and everything changed." Olivia thanked her with a warm smile, but after the conversation ended, she quietly turned to me. "I never imagined one honest moment could encourage someone I had never even met." I squeezed her hand gently. "That is how real influence works. You rarely see all the lives it reaches." Later that evening, Richard closed the retreat with a simple speech instead of an elaborate presentation. He stood without notes, looked around the room, and spoke from the heart. "When I founded this company," he said, "I believed our greatest asset would always be talented people. I still believe that. But today I understand something even more important. Talented people remain exceptional because someone supports them, challenges them, encourages them, and reminds them of their value when they forget it themselves. If we protect that culture, every future success will have a stronger foundation than any quarterly report could ever measure." The room rose in a standing ovation, not because of impressive business results, but because everyone recognized the sincerity behind his words. As Olivia and I drove home beneath a sky filled with brilliant autumn colors, she rested her head lightly against the passenger seat and smiled toward the passing landscape. "Do you know what my favorite part of this entire journey has been?" she asked. I glanced at her briefly before returning my eyes to the road. "Tell me," she answered without hesitation. "Winning the award was wonderful, but discovering that gratitude can change people far beyond our own family has been the greatest reward of all." I smiled quietly because I knew exactly what she meant. The celebration that had once seemed destined to end as a single memorable dinner had grown into something much larger. It had become a reminder that achievements eventually fade into history, while kindness, encouragement, and sincere appreciation continue shaping lives long after the applause has ended. Nearly 1 year later, the anniversary of that unforgettable evening arrived without either of us mentioning it beforehand. Life had continued moving forward, but the lessons we learned had quietly become part of our daily routine. Olivia still excelled at work, yet she no longer defined herself by awards or rankings. Richard continued leading the company, but he now spent as much time investing in people as he did reviewing financial reports. Melissa often told us that the workplace felt noticeably different. Employees collaborated more openly, managers listened more carefully, and new hires quickly discovered they were joining a culture built on encouragement instead of constant comparison. One Friday evening, Richard invited the family and several longtime employees back to the same restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. As we walked into the familiar private dining room, I immediately recognized the large windows, the warm lighting, and the view of the city skyline reflecting across the water. Everything looked almost identical to the celebration held the previous year, yet the atmosphere felt completely transformed. There was no tension waiting beneath polite smiles. There were no unspoken worries hiding behind professional success. There was only genuine appreciation shared among people who had learned to value one another beyond job titles. During dinner, conversations flowed naturally from business to family, from future goals to favorite memories. People laughed more freely than before. Younger employees shared stories about projects they had completed together. Experienced managers spoke proudly about colleagues they had mentored. Richard listened more than he talked, occasionally smiling as he watched everyone enjoying the evening together. When dessert arrived, he stood with a small glass in his hand. The room gradually became quiet. For a brief moment, I found myself remembering the same silence from a year earlier, but this time it carried anticipation instead of uncertainty. Richard looked around the room before speaking. "Last year," he said warmly, "we gathered here to celebrate one remarkable achievement. None of us realized that evening would also change the way we understood success." He paused briefly before continuing. "Today I would like to celebrate something even greater. Not a trophy, not a sales record, not a quarterly report. I would like to celebrate the relationships that have become stronger because we learned to express gratitude instead of assuming people already knew how much they mattered." Every person in the room listened with complete attention. Richard smiled toward Olivia. "You reminded us that recognition should never stop with the person standing on the stage." He then looked at me. "And you reminded us that quiet support can shape extraordinary outcomes without ever asking for applause." I smiled modestly, feeling the same way I had always felt. Recognition had never been my goal. Watching the people I loved grow stronger together was more meaningful than any public acknowledgement. Olivia reached for my hand beneath the table and gave it a gentle squeeze. Richard continued speaking. "Because of what began here 1 year ago, our company has become healthier, our leadership has become wiser, and our family has become closer. Those changes will always matter more than any award hanging on an office wall." The room responded with sincere applause, but nobody applauded because someone had won. They applauded because everyone understood the journey that had brought us there. After dinner, Olivia and I stepped onto the balcony overlooking the river. The evening air felt cool, and the city lights shimmered across the water exactly as they had the year before. She smiled as we stood quietly beside each other. "Do you remember what you told me after everything happened?" she asked. I thought for a moment before answering. "I told you that sometimes the greatest achievement is helping people see those who quietly stand behind success." She nodded. "You were right, but I have learned something else since then." I looked at her with curiosity. "What is that?" She smiled gently. "Success may open doors, but gratitude keeps those doors open for everyone who follows." I wrapped my arm around her shoulders as we looked across the skyline together. At that moment, I realized the award that had once seemed like the most important event of our lives had become only the beginning of a much larger story. Trophies eventually lose their shine. Records are eventually broken. Titles eventually change. But kindness, humility, encouragement, and gratitude continue growing through every conversation, every shared challenge, and every act of quiet support. If our family accomplished anything truly lasting, it was not measured by sales numbers or company recognition. It was measured by the simple decision to appreciate one another before another celebration became necessary. Looking back now, I no longer remember that evening as the night my wife received an award. I remember it as the night our family finally discovered what success was always supposed to mean.